Do you remember the first time you played Resident Evil? It presented a feeling that in all honesty is on another level, beyond anything ever witnessed in the early days of 3D horror games. It was way ahead of its time with its visual presentation, mixing movie quality video and detailed low poly visuals and stunning photorealistic pre-rendered backgrounds that brought the realism of video game horror into reality. Resident Evil was and still is a groundbreaking title that built upon the blueprint previously seen with the original Alone in the Dark, that brought the horror and gore factor to a whole new level not witnessed before. It was the game that set the scene for survival horror to evolve into its own entity that would play a pivotal role in the development of future game concepts, with some of the industry's most creative minds being responsible for many of the horror genre's scariest games. There were many ups and downs during the early years of horror games, with some interesting titles and some forgettable entries that all in their own stance paved the way for the success of future titles. It was an interesting time for the video game industry, and it's an area that we must look back on to understand how the future of horror games would come to be, where I will also share my own personal story of playing Resident Evil and the impact it made on me from that point on, so no time like the present. If you are a fan of horror games, you may have become accustomed to the abundance of titles that are currently available in mainstream media, with popular companies and smaller indie development teams setting standards and pushing boundaries of what was possible to create horrific and impactful experiences that will stay with you long after you have played. While many series and titles have found huge success over the years, there was a time when horror wasn't as popular, especially during the early gaming generations, with limitations on hardware and resources, leaving it difficult for development teams to figure out a narrative they could follow or implement to create anything worthwhile. There were many attempts to depict horror games with ports of iconic movies of the time, but many fell short on reflecting on what could make games truly scary. In many cases, the scariest elements of these games would come from the unique art designs that covered the front of game cases and instruction manuals that would initially get you hyped but would quickly fill you with a sense of disappointment trying to understand what it was that you had just played. It would take some time for horror games to truly come into their own, and it wouldn't be until the early to mid 90s with the evolution of 3D consoles and technology where developers could really unleash their creativity, no longer bound to the extreme hardware limitations of early console generations, to present some of the scariest and most influential experiences ever seen in video games. The early depictions of this would come in the form of Alone in the Dark, originally released on PC platforms in 1992. That was the first game of its kind to implement the now tried and tested pre-rendered background aesthetic, using the often hated tank control system to navigate a derelict, haunted mansion. While many questioned the gameplay style and control systems back then, it was a revelation. 2 years later, in 1994, would see the release of Dr. Hauser in Japan on the Panasonic 3DO games console that played from a similar perspective but would use full 3D visuals and allow for the transition of different playing styles from fixed camera to first person and overhead perspectives, which was unique in its own right, but like Alone in the Dark, relied on a lot of trial and error to understand many of the game's quirks and difficult puzzles, as you would end up dying many times before you eventually figured out what to do. I personally never had the opportunity to experience these games back in the day, as many of them were console or platform specific, and you would need to own or have a friend who had one of these platforms to have any access to the games. Luckily, in recent times, this element is now more accessible through the use of emulation, or if you can get hold of some original hardware and accessories. It is possible, but if you look at the prices these days of retro games and consoles, it is highly unlikely that the majority of us could afford them anyway, so emulation will look like a more promising option. I mainly grew up playing games on 2D systems with the Sega Master System, Mega Drive and Nintendo consoles, so 3D games were a completely new concept that I had yet to experience. The earliest depictions of horror games that I witnessed growing up would come from playing Master of Darkness, Alien 3 and Bram Stoker's Dracula on the Sega Master System, all of which are great games that also piqued the interest to figure out what else could be possible. It would take a few years before this would become a reality, as we were still in the era of 8 and 16-bit consoles. However, games on PC platforms were making some headway in the early 90s, with horror games mainly through early RPG outings, strategy games and point and click adventures, but still struggled to depict a true sense of realism and atmosphere within horror games. But that would change with the PlayStation. While it released in 1994 in Japan and later in 1995 in other regions, It would be almost 2 years before I would get to experience the power and suspense of this unique console. It wasn't until Christmas of 1996 when I would get my first taste of experiencing a new era of gaming that changed everything for me, with a friend getting a PlayStation and one of the first games I played on the system that I consider to be the most influential horror game ever created, which would be Resident Evil. It was an unusual experience at first for me, as growing up I would be terrified of watching horror movies. I would always be the one running behind the sofa or out of the room when something frightening was about to happen, while my brothers and friends would watch without any care in the world, and it took years for me to sit and fully watch a horror movie in its entirety, which I eventually did at the age of 13 with Stephen King's It. However, I would still be somewhat reluctant to dive further into watching more horror movies for some time, as growing up I always had a strong visual mind, as I could always remember names, places and faces and positive experiences. But I would also consider that as a curse, as I could also remember and never forget the visual scenes from movies that terrified me, that would scare me for a very long time. So when I first got the opportunity to try Resident Evil, honestly I was reluctant in the beginning, but the fact that everything witnessed was all part of a video game, it just found a way to draw me in, as at the time I was totally obsessed with playing video games all of the time. I would spend hours daydreaming of playing video games and listening to my favourite game tracks in my head, so playing Resident Evil presented a new opportunity to witness something completely different from what I was used to, that also led me to step out of my comfort zone in a way that I wasn't willing to do before. It was a combination of all of these elements, along with some of the other games I got to play, that left a lasting impression like no other. My friend had other games with Shockwave Assault, Time Commando and many demos with incredible games from Formula 1, Destruction Derby, Wipeout 2097, Jumping Flash, Loaded and Battle Arena Toshinden, among others. But it would be Resident Evil that stole the show, as it was the first real game I had ever played that truly terrified me in ways that I never thought possible. It brought back all of those fears of being terrified from watching horror movies growing up, but at the same time I found myself getting excited while wanting to see and learn more about the game, which I didn't expect to happen. From the first boot up sequence of the iconic PlayStation sound to the beginning intro sequence of the game, seeing a man who I had no idea of at the time walking through a dark hallway to turn around and start screaming with the explosion of blood splattering all over the screen, and hearing the voice say the name has forever been ingrained in my memory, which was truly unforgettable. If that wasn't enough, the next section saw you being introduced to the character, story and plot with live actors that looked and felt like a movie scene. The beginning of the game starting with Jill Valentine, Albert Wesker and Barry Burton being introduced and trying to make sense of what just happened left you wanting to know more. Acting aside, I was hooked and instantly drawn into what was happening. Once you were given control of Jill for the first time, my mind couldn't fathom or figure out what to do, or even how to move the character. It was the first time I had ever had the opportunity to try and move a game character around in a 3D space, and let's just say it took a while to get used to. I struggled to completely understand the control system with moving Jill Valentine or Chris Redfield around the mansion hall and corridors, that it felt so surreal, as it felt almost like real life. You were amazed, intrigued, curious and terrified all at the same time. The game provided a surreal capability to allow you to feel a rush of all of those emotions all at once. It really was beyond anything I could have imagined. And with encountering the zombie for the first time, tearing apart the body of Kenneth, one of the Star's Alpha Team members, you realised very quickly that this was something else entirely. In that moment, I had grown up, as it presented a newfound responsibility to survive. Mind you, it didn't last long, as it quickly became the next meal for the undead monstrosity that was standing in front of me. It became apparent in that moment that this was very different from playing 2D games like Super Mario Bros. Or Sonic the Hedgehog. Resident Evil was an entirely different beast. The sense of tension, fear, dread, uncertainty, all of those pent up emotions completely overwhelmed me, to a point that I had to sit back for a while and watch my friend play, all while trying to understand, reflect and make sense of what I had just experienced. Never before had I played a game that felt like an actual movie, that you were the focal point and centre of the action. Never had I felt the surge of so many emotions from playing a video game, and while many would shy away from its terrifying presence, I was instantly curious and wanted to understand more about the game's lore and story, which is something I normally would not do. But for that to happen, I would need to literally overcome my fear and persist with playing the game. While I would pluck up the courage to venture back into the game after a while, my friend was also careful not to give away too many spoilers, as he was more interested in seeing my terrified reactions to what would lie in wait, so I ventured forward. But again, my newfound confidence evaporated very quickly, as no sooner had I somehow managed to re-enter the mansion and finally escape from the first zombie encounter, that you would be met with the first of many jump scares, seeing the zombie dogs crash through the windows of a long angled hallway. The impact of the adrenaline, along with the background music, brought about a rush of panic, trying to figure out what to do. Should I stand and fight, or should I try to escape? And this was all alongside dealing with my lack of understanding of the controls, so you can only imagine the chaos that ensued. I quickly found myself on the game over screen, after yet becoming another meal to the many monsters roaming around this insanely huge mansion that seemed like a never-ending labyrinth of corridors, hallways, locked doors and hidden rooms. The suspense and atmosphere was mesmerising, terrifying and intoxicating, leaving you with an appetite to persist, which resulted in, after taking a break to try some other games, would find myself being itching to venture into the chaos once again, to a point that I saw myself trying to play the game long into the hours of the night, when everyone else had fallen asleep. A new addiction was building throughout this experience, while providing an unusual sense of feeling that I had never felt before, even having spent years playing video games growing up. Continuing to play Resident Evil early the next morning saw my skill level slightly improve, with my friend guiding me further into the mansion to access more locked rooms and find a shotgun with a unique puzzle tied to it. But as in with all my other earlier experiences, I fell foul to one of the unsuspecting traps that you will come across in the game. But that didn't deter me from trying again, gradually finding my way back to the shotgun room again, only to leave it and explore further, to find the plant room with a large water fountain, seeing huge tentacles flailing around. At this point I had begun to understand the running mechanics, so in my newfound confidence venturing back into the previous hallway, gingerly avoiding one zombie to run around the corner, only to be grabbed and chomped on by another. I just couldn't catch a break, but still I was excited, even though I almost needed a new pair of pants. Knowing right well I couldn't get any further at that point, I knew I would have to come back and play the game again in the future. The new reality of witnessing a transition with playing these new games provided a high sense of realism that was truly astounding. Playing games based on real life and futuristic themes, along with experiencing sheer terror through visible character interactions, left me with a feeling of nervousness and delight to what I was seeing, a feeling that I have never been able to replicate, which only solidifies my thoughts on why I consider the original PlayStation as my favourite console of all time. So excited with the experience after getting home later the next day, I immediately went to share my stories and findings with my brothers and some of my friends who were there, only to be met with reluctance to understand what I was getting all excited about. They too had never played anything related with newer consoles such as the PlayStation, so it got to a point that I realised that they needed to witness the experience for themselves, which they would get to do so in the weeks that followed. And in the weeks that followed, the topic of discussion was mainly about the PlayStation and the experiences with Resident Evil, as never before had I spent so much time talking about a single game. I literally drove people mad. Eventually both my brothers and friends also got to experience the game for themselves, and they finally understood the hype, where they too could not believe what they had just witnessed. The game blew their minds also, seeing zombies' heads exploding as a result of a well-placed shotgun blast left a lasting impact like no other. On one particular weekend, my friend had taken his PlayStation down to my house, and he had a few save files on his memory card, with one of them being saved toward the end of the game, but unfortunately he couldn't finish the game as he had used up all of the ammunition you could find, and all he had left was literally 2 bullets in the standard Beretta pistol to fend off against the final encounter, which was never going to work. Another of the save files found you in the guardhouse outside of the mansion, and one of the first rooms I ventured into was at the end of the corridor in the first hallway with large red double doors, to witness an even more terrifying entity with the large spiders. I thought the zombies were scary, but these things were truly terrifying upon seeing them for the first time, that I quickly ran out of the room and simply was unwilling to venture back into it. The game just kept surprising you with its traps and scares to a point that you would almost become frozen with fear. The lads also spent time playing this game also, and they too could not believe what they were witnessing. From that point on, they had found a new respect for the PlayStation, and even for me, as they now believed that what I had been telling them all along was 100% true. In the months that followed from that point on saw us renting out a PlayStation almost every weekend, where we could pick from a selection of 2 available games, and it was a dead cert that Resident Evil had to be one of the games each time, as we all had become totally addicted to its story and lore. We were totally addicted to fully understanding the game, its intricacies, weapons, what items were best to use in different scenarios, exploring all areas to find hidden items or secrets as one of the best and most unique elements that we could find in the game. We didn't have access to save files with a memory card at the time, so we had to make each playthrough count, as it would take ages to replay and find our way back to the point where we struggled to get past, not knowing at each time that the weapon choices have a huge impact on making each altercation easier or more difficult, presenting many interesting outcomes. This would result in many death occurrences, from being chomped on by zombies and dogs, to decapitations from the hunter's huge claws and leaping attacks, to being swallowed whole by a gigantic mutated snake, forcing many playthroughs from the beginning to relive the horror all over again. This game would simply crucify you for bad mistakes and poor choices, so you had no other option but to learn from them to have any chance of witnessing the story all the way to the end credits. One of the most underrated ideas of playing the original Resident Evil is having control over how parts of the story and cutscenes play out depending on how you interact with the elements within the environment at different stages. Resident Evil just kept surprising you with all of its hidden traits and features that in many ways was way ahead of its time. There was always something new to find and experience, which only heightened the overall respect for the game, so much in a way that this game is usually the topic of discussion whenever we all meet up to talk about games we are playing, as there was so much replay value that you would always find yourself coming back for more. A lot of these experiences we often chat about that can be found on our podcast channel, the Casual Gamers Project podcast, if you want to know more, so there will be a link in the description. When we were in the height of playing Resident Evil back in the day, myself and the lads would often find ourselves also diving into magazine articles to find any glimpses of additional content that we had yet to discover, also to look at the many other games in development with previously unseen concepts, even to find out more of what could be coming in the future. We were so invested in the Resident Evil experience that we also couldn't wait to see if there would be another sequel, which luckily we wouldn't have to wait long for, with the announcement of Resident Evil 2 in early 1997, which again got everyone even more excited. Looking at magazine previews of the game's early development was a unique time, as we had never been so excited to see a sequel to a game as much as this. Later that year would see the announcement of Resident Evil Director's Cut, that would also see fans being able to get their first glimpse to play and experience a preview demo of Resident Evil 2, which you can only imagine the excitement that ensued. But little did we know that at the time this package was to make up for the development difficulties of Resident Evil 2, with the original game concept being scrapped to work on a new version which saw elements of this new style being added to the preview demo disc. We must not forget about the many books, puzzles and detailed notes that help to explore the intricate story behind the events of Resident Evil, that provide more clarity around the events leading up to the outbreak. There is many of them to find throughout the story, and they all tell their own personal details of what happened leading up to the events of the mansion incident. Honestly, it did not matter, as you were now getting the chance to play Resident Evil 2 for the first time, with all of the months of hype and excitement leading up to this, and it just left you wanting more. Resident Evil Director's Cut provided a new way to play the original game, with additional elements, resources, more enemies, an auto-aim feature, and increased difficulty, with random item and enemy placements providing a different experience from what was seen in the original version. The only downside to this version was that the music wasn't as good, and didn't fit in with building the tension and terrifying atmosphere that had been seen in the original, but it was still a unique package, with the Resident Evil 2 demo being the highlight of the experience. Resident Evil is a massive icon within the realm of horror and video games, that it set the standard for almost every horror game that came after it. It is also the game that began and built the foundation of the survival horror genre, and honestly, no other game has left as much of a lasting impact on myself, family and friends as much as Resident Evil, that is still the topic of discussion even to this day. The surreal sense of terror and dread when you experience it for the first time is left a feeling that can never be replicated or forgotten. For me personally, only a handful of games have managed to capture that feeling to some degree, with both Resident Evil 2, Resident Evil 3, and with the many encounters of both Mr. X and the Nemesis being among the scariest ever in gaming, along with other games such as Hell Knight and Silent Hill, two of the most disturbing games on the PlayStation that really affect your mental state as a player, which brought about a whole new concept to the survival horror experience. We must not forget the soundtracks, sound effects, and atmospheric tones that this game utilised, as it also heightened the entirety of the atmosphere and presented a very different experience that can still be felt even to this day. Not only is Resident Evil one of the most influential and scariest games of all time, but its soundtrack is one of the most memorable ever seen in a video game, and that too also plays a pivotal role in the game's success, and that formula would also be carried on into future entries in the series that too also found great success, while also leaving a very lasting impact on us as players that we will truly never forget. When the remake of Resident Evil was announced for the Nintendo GameCube in 2001, it would be the first time since the original games where I was just as excited as ever to play a new, updated version of the game with incredible visuals that still hold up even to this day. Retelling the story along with providing new areas to explore and new enemy encounters, especially with the Crimson Head zombies, was even more terrifying than before. It was the darkest and most atmospheric Resident Evil game I had ever played that rivaled the suspense of the first three games, but also that of Silent Hill. It is a true survival horror masterpiece, without question. I was so excited that I initially went out and bought a Nintendo GameCube console just to play this game. But for me, nothing beats the first Resident Evil experience, I have to admit. It was the perfect game to play at the perfect time. Having experienced the transition of playing games in 3D for the first time, after having played games like Sonic the Hedgehog, Super Mario, Street Fighter 2 and Mortal Kombat for years, that presented something that we will never see or witness again. As with modern day gaming and systems, we have grown to expect or predict what is happening, which can dilute the experience for many, which we often take for granted. But back then, with the beginning of the PlayStation, Sega Saturn and 32-bit consoles, we didn't expect, understand, or were ready for what was happening until you were playing it for the first time, and you knew in that moment you were witnessing something special. I think for me it was a combination of playing the game for the first time while staying over at a friend's house over the weekend, which is something we all did as kids growing up, and the fact that I had no real idea of what the PlayStation was up until that point only heightened the overall experience, as I really didn't know what to expect at first, and it would take some time, even when playing all of those games on the console, to make sense of what was happening at that exact time. But yet at the same time, seeing that this was the beginning of something new that had never really been seen before in mainstream media just completely blew your mind. That is why it is good to share these stories and experiences, as they allow us to relive those nostalgic and important memories, as they too help to influence and shape the way we would continue to play games moving forward, into future generations, as they are memories that we can truly never forget. Even with all of the new ideas and concepts of modern technology, nothing can even come close to the feeling these classic games will give you. Only those who grew up during these times will truly understand and appreciate those experiences, as it really was a special time to be a gamer. No other generation, I feel, has ever made the impact the way that it has, more than this generation with the PlayStation and Sega Saturn. But we must not forget the PC generation during this time also, as it too was breaking new grounds with interesting ideas that would also influence the future of gaming. While I have shared some of my stories and experiences with Resident Evil, I am interested in knowing what your memories are of the game, or what was the first game you played during the PlayStation or Sega Saturn era, where you felt that it was going to change how you experience playing games moving forward. So make sure to share it down in the comments below. With that being said, there is still so much more to discover with this legendary series that would define many new ways to experience horror in later generations, finding new ways to scale players and evolve the franchise even further. And to see more on how Resident Evil influenced the horror gaming landscape, you should definitely check out this next video that will look at the many ideas that were inspired by the game that redefined the survival horror genre.